Iri nini en chen en Ra empet. I make a welcome for you for Ra in the sky. Welcome back to the History of Egypt podcast, episode 201, Hathor and the Destruction of Humanity. Around 1295 BCE, professional sculptors were hard at work in the Valley of the Kings. They were excavating the royal tomb of Pharaoh Seti I. The king's grave had been underway since early in his rule, and now, around year 10 or so, the artists were finally starting to decorate it. Seti's tomb is commonly described as a masterpiece of funerary art and imagery. The wall carvings are exquisite in detail and precision. The paint is vibrant and colourful. The scenery is varied, the compositions harmonious. There is a wealth of religious and philosophical information recorded on these walls. Today, I want to focus on a tiny side chamber, which bears an interesting tale. Just off the main burial hall, to your right when you enter that room, a low doorway gives access to a secret room. The chamber is tiny, about 3 meters wide and just 2 meters high. It is not a focal point of the monument, and it's not designed to hold fabulous treasures or anything. But the decoration of this room is incredibly valuable. When you peek through the doorway, your eyes will naturally focus on the western wall. Here, the surface is dominated by a large mural. A cow with long horns that curve upwards from its head. The animal is striding forward, moving towards your left, and beneath her, clustered between the hooves and legs, there is a whole gaggle of deities. Tiny figures, all male, are attending to the cow. They reach out to lightly touch her limbs, perhaps stroking the fur on her haunches and knees. In the center, a larger god stands tall, with his arms raised up, placing hands upon the cow's belly. This central god has a name, Shu, written in hieroglyphs before his face. He is the Lord of Air, who stands beneath the cow's belly and reaches up to support her. The belly of the cow is adorned with stars, suggesting that this animal lives in the sky. Solidifying that point, there are 2 emblems at the front and rear of the cow's body. They are hard to see today, but if you look closely, you can find 2 ships, or barks. One is at the cow's chest, just in front of her foreleg. The other is at the rear, beneath the cow's udders. The barks are symbols of the solar deity Ra, who uses them to travel across the sky by day and by night. The day bark and the evening bark are Ra's methods of transportation as he makes his endless journey across the vault of heaven. In this tiny chamber of Seti I, those barks are traveling on the body of a cow. The art is intriguing, and it's not a common motif in royal tombs. What does it mean? Well, for that, we must look at the walls. All around this tiny chamber, columns of hieroglyphs record an ancient story. It is a religious tale, a myth if you prefer, and it describes a time long, long, long ago. An age of prehistory, when the gods themselves ruled on Earth, interacting directly with humanity. It was an age of prosperity and justice, when many of the natural phenomena and human institutions came into being. It was the age of Ra. The story I am about to share was first written down around 1300 BCE, at the very end of the 18th Egyptian dynasty and the start of the 19th. Today, you will find this story going by a couple of names. The most common ones are the Book of the Heavenly Cow, or Book of the Sky Cow, and also the Destruction of Mankind, or the Destruction of Humanity. It is a religious story, a myth if you prefer, and it centers on the sun god Ra. The story tells of an age when Ra ruled on Earth directly, but one day a group of humans rebelled against the sun god. They abandoned his kingdom and went into the desert seeking their own destiny. Enraged, Ra called forth his Eye, a goddess who acted as a bodyguard or enforcer. Her name was Hathor, and Ra commanded this goddess to go down to Earth and punish the humans for rebellion. What followed was a dramatic and terrible slaughter. The Book of the Sky Cow is etiological. That is a fancy way of saying it explains why the world is the way it is. The story tells us why the great and all-powerful gods do not come to Earth directly in order to rule us. It also explains why the universe is organized in the manner that it is, and it explains the place of humanity within this divinely constructed system. The story itself is relatively simple, although quite dramatic and full of references to deeper Egyptian theology. I'll explain it as we go, and then in the second half I will unpack some of the scholarship. So, sit back, relax, and enjoy a tale of human rebellion and the gods' terrible response. This is the Book of the Sky Cow. Our story begins long, long ago. In the distant ages of prehistory, before pharaohs, before pyramids, before the kingdom of Egypt itself. Back then, everyone in the universe, both humans and gods, lived under the power of Ra. Ra, the sun god, the one who created himself, was king of everything. Now, Ra ruled the living world, human, animal, and divine, and he had done so for aeons. Here, our story begins. Quote, "Once it came to pass under the majesty of Ra, the self-created god, that when he had been in the kingship over humanity and the gods together, humans proceeded to make a plot against him. They did so because his majesty, life, prosperity, and health had grown old. His bones were silver, his flesh was gold, his hair was genuine lapis lazuli. But his majesty, Ra, became aware of the plan that was being contrived against him, and so Ra said to his entourage, 'Summon to me my Eye,' that is, the goddess called the Eye of Ra. Summon the Eye together with Shu, the air, Tefnut, the moisture, Geb, the earth, and Nut, the sky, as well as the fathers and mothers who were together with me when I was in Nun, the infinite waters. And also bring the god Nun with his courtiers together. Bring them in secret so that humanity does not see, so that the gods may offer their excellent advice. It is within Nun, the place where I originated, that I shall go.' Thus, these gods were brought to Ra, and they were positioned to either side of him. The gods touched their foreheads to the ground, bowing in his majesty's presence, so that Ra might state his problem in the presence of his father, Nun, the infinite waters, the one who is the maker of the Remech people, humanity, and the Rekhith people, the commoners. Then the gods said to his majesty Ra, 'Speak to us, so that we may learn about things.' Then Ra spoke to Nun, his father, and he said, 'O eldest god, in whom I originated, and you, ancestral gods, behold, humanity, who originated from my Eye, has made a plot against me. Tell me, what would you do about this rebellion? I am seeking a solution. I cannot slay the humans until I have heard what you might say about it.' Then the majesty of Nun himself replied. He said, 'O Ra, my son, the god who is mightier even than the one who produced you, that is, myself, Stay put upon your throne. Your terror, or the fear of you, is great. Instead, your eye, the goddess, shall proceed against those who conspire against you. But the majesty of Ra spoke in turn, saying, Look, the humans have fled into the desert. Their hearts are fearful because of what I might say to them. And they, the gods, also spoke to his majesty, saying, Indeed, send out your eye. Let the eye smite them for you, the ones who have conspired so falsely. No other eye is as capable as yours. May the eye descend in the form of Hathor. End quote. The story begins in the middle of things. Ra has been king for some time. How long? Who knows? And humans perceive his age as a weakness, a chance to abandon his kingdom. But of course, Ra learns of the plot, and the action begins to unfold. A couple of things to note here. First, the story is told almost entirely from Ra's perspective. As we'll see, 90% of the action is focused on him and his court. Secondly, the way the story is told, its structure and language, that bears a strong resemblance to war narratives of the New Kingdom pharaohs. Kings like Seti I, Thutmose III, or Ramesses the Great would often describe their military campaigns in similar language and structure. Their stories of battle would always begin at the royal palace, where the king would hear about a rebellion or a threat from their enemies. From there, they would start their plans and marshal their forces. In similar circumstances, the sun god Ra responds in the same manner. Notably, Ra does not launch into action immediately. First, he takes counsel with his fellow gods and his infinite father, Nun, the watery abyss. That is important. Around 1300 BCE, when the story first appears in tombs, the pharaohs like to portray themselves as men of action, decisive. But kings like Seti I often begin their war narratives with a council. They do not rush into things arrogantly. They listen, they plan, and they consider their options. It is an important motif for a wise and considered ruler. Decision and action are vital, but a strong leader plans before they move. So, Ra summons the gods who are part of his court, and they debate the course of action. The argument is simple. Should Ra punish his enemies in person, like a warrior, or should he send an agent, a servant, to enforce his will? Ra wants to go directly, but everyone else says, No, this is beneath you. Send out your eye. The Eye of Ra is a title borne by goddesses who act as bodyguards and enforcers for the sun god, a kind of divine Dora Milaje. There are several of these eye goddesses, and they show up in various tales, doing Ra's dirty work. Today, the eye comes as Hathor. Hathor, the divine cow, might seem like a strange pick. Think of cows and you think of placidity, milk, nourishment, and those are qualities that Hathor can embody. But this goddess does have a dark side, a shadow that descends when times are bad and violence is required. That dark side has a name, and it is a distinct goddess. We are about to meet her. Quote, Then this goddess returned after she had slain humanity in the desert. The majesty of Ra said, Welcome back, Hathor. Have you accomplished that for which you set out? Hathor replied, As you live for me, I have overpowered humanity, and doing so was pleasant to my heart. The majesty of Ra said, I shall gain power over them as king, so please hold off on destroying them utterly. But Sekhmet came into being. End quote. Wait, what? Did Hathor just go down, wreak havoc, and come back entirely off-screen? Apparently. The story skips the first rampage and stays focused on Ra and his court. There is a practical reason for this. The story itself is being carved in writing on the walls of a tomb, and when the ancient Egyptians did that, they were extremely careful with negative forces and imagery. Hieroglyph writing and the art that complements it have a magic of their own. Everything you write, whether a spell, a prayer, a song, or a story, those have the power to affect reality in this world and the next. So while a scene of bloodthirsty slaughter is certainly more dramatic from a storytelling perspective, you don't necessarily want a massacre happening while the king is trying to navigate the underworld. Alas, it is slightly disappointing for a modern audience who are often accustomed, even enthusiastic, for a bit of the old ultra-violence. But for the ancient artisans and the theologians, that simply wouldn't be appropriate in the physical and religious context. Fortunately, our imaginations can fill in the gaps. We can picture the great divine cow stomping across the land, her hooves crushing humans beneath. The cow bellows in joy at this newfound thrill she has discovered. Who knew slaughter could be so deliciously fun? Anyway, when Hathor returns, Ra is satisfied, and he says, "That's enough for now. I'm going to rule these people as king, so we don't want to eliminate them." Unfortunately, Hathor rather enjoyed the violence. It was pleasing to my heart, she said. And that is a bad sign, because in the next phrase, the goddess takes on a new form or avatar. She becomes Sekhmet. Sekhmet, or Sekhmet, the feminine form of the word power, needs very little introduction. The lioness, the Eye of Ra, the lady of war, famine, plague, and destruction. Sekhmet is one of the most dangerous deities in the ancient Egyptian pantheon. Certainly, she is the most dangerous for humans as a group. Compare, for example, the chaotic Sutekh, or Seth, who is a danger to Horus and the legitimate kingship, or the serpent Apep, Apophis, who is a threat to Ra and the fabric of the universe. Compared to them, Sekhmet's threat is more direct, more recognizable, and immediate to human concerns. And in some ways, Sekhmet is actually worse than those other destroyers. Unlike Sutekh or Apep, Sekhmet is deliberate in her destruction. The Chaos God does what he does because that is his nature. He's arrogant, foolish, and constantly misguided. The devouring serpent simply consumes, but he doesn't have any real agency in his mind. Sekhmet knows what she is doing. She is intentional when she destroys. And what's more, she's fully capable of helping humans when she wants to. Along with the war and the plague, Sekhmet can also be a healer, protecting humans from the very forces that she unleashes. So when an epidemic affected the people or the land, it was Sekhmet that humans beseeched for deliverance. From one perspective, Sekhmet is the nurse of humanity, but also their abuser. And when the mood strikes her, there is nothing rational or logical that can restrain the goddess, as the next part of the story is about to illustrate. Sekhmet goes forth, and now Ra has a problem. Quote, "Thus Sekhmet came into being. She waded in the blood of the humans, starting at Hut-Nesut, the city of Heracleopolis in the north. But Ra said, 'Summon to me swift messengers, whose pace is as quick as a shadow.' These emissaries were brought to him directly. The majesty of this god, Ra, said to the messengers, 'Run to Abu, Elephantine, and fetch me red ochre in great quantity.' So this red ochre was brought to him. Ra assigned the side-locked one who is in Iyunu, that is, the high priest of Ra at the city of Heliopolis, to pound the red ochre, while serving women ground the barley for beer. The red ochre was added to the beer so that it looked just like human blood. 7,000 beer jars were produced. Then the majesty of the king of southern and northern Egypt, Ra, came with these gods to inspect the beer. It was evening of the day when Sekhmet was going to slaughter the humans during her days of journeying north. But Ra said, "How good this is! I will save humanity from her." And he said, "Transport the beer to the place where Sekhmet said she would slay the humans." End quote. Again, the author does not describe Sekhmet's slaughter in detail. Clearly, we're supposed to get it from context. Everyone in Egypt knew what Sekhmet was about. When the tale says she came into being, the meaning was clear to them. I guess the modern equivalent would be if I said, terrible hardship occurred in Germany after World War I, and so the Nazis came into being. Chances are you know what that means, you know it's terrible, and you know what happens next. For the ancients, Sekhmet was a destructive force that did not require explanation. Again, it's frustrating for a modern audience, but you can imagine what is going on. The lioness rampaged, her magic sweeping through the land. Her roar chilled the bones, sickening the heart. Her breath was plague, infecting children and adults alike. Her paws, sharp of claw, opened wounds in flesh, drawing forth the blood. Her fangs pierced heart, lungs, and vital organs, rupturing bodies and bringing people low. Sekhmet bounded eagerly across Egypt. In the wake of her power, the dead and dying multiplied. To stop the goddess, who was beyond rational restraint, the gods resorted to trickery. Ra organized the production of beer in vast quantity that was dyed red to resemble blood. Hopefully, Sekhmet would drink this blood beer and become easier to handle. Would it work? Well, let's find out. Quote, "That night, the majesty of Ra got up early to have this intoxicating beverage poured out. The fields became inundated to a height of 3 palm widths, covered with the liquid by the power of this god. And behold, when Sekhmet set out in the morning, she found these fields covered with the blood beer. Her face became delighted at the sight of it. She proceeded to drink, and it was excellent in her taste. Sekhmet returned to the sky, so drunk that she had been unable to even recognize humanity. Thus, the majesty of Ra said to this goddess, 'Welcome back.' And Ra told Sekhmet that intoxicating drinks will be prepared for her on the seasonal feasts of the year. Serving women would be responsible for this, and so the preparation of intoxicating drinks became the job of the serving woman on the festival of Hathor for all people since the first day." End quote. Ra creates an ocean of blood covering the fields and river of Egypt. Sekhmet wades out into it and begins to drink, slurping it up like a great lioness vampire. Naturally, since it is beer, Sekhmet becomes very sleepy, and the violence which is her nature is calmed and quietened. When she returns, it seems that Sekhmet has become Hathor once again, the more placid of her incarnations. Ra speaks to Hathor and praises her for returning obediently, and he promises that during the year, regular festivals in honor of Hathor will include great quantities of beer. This is one of those etiological sections, a story that explains why things are the way they are. In this case, we get an explanation for why the festivals of Hathor specifically involve drunkenness. Because alcohol stopped the goddess, the people who live in her towns celebrate with a party. It has been that way for as long as anyone can remember, and the story tells us why. This is one of those beats that you can imagine folks sitting under the stars or resting by a cook fire and sharing stories. The children are sitting on adults' knees, listening closely, and when the storyteller is finished, they look each child in the eye and say, And that, young one, is why we do things this way. The child smiles or ponders it quietly, and the legend of the goddess takes hold. We now come to the final section of the narrative. It's a bit convoluted in the Egyptian, so I've cleaned it up. But as the story itself concludes, we hear of Ra's response to all these events. Quote, "And the majesty of Ra said, 'As I live for myself, my heart is too weary to remain with the humans. If I do, I might slay them to the very last one. The reach of my arm, my power, should not diminish in any way.' But the gods who were in Ra's entourage said to him, 'Do not withdraw. You still have power over anything that you desire.' But the majesty of Ra spoke to the majesty of Nun, his father, and he said, 'My body is weak for the first time ever. I will not wait until another threat reaches me.' And Nun replied to Ra, saying, 'My son, the god Shu, the heir, shall now serve as your protection. My daughter Nut, the sky, shall place you upon her back.' Nut spoke up at this, saying, 'Father Nun, how will I do that?' And Nun replied, 'Do not be foolish.' And so Nut became a cow, the sky cow, if you will, and the majesty of Ra placed himself upon the back of it." End quote. The story wraps up with two important points. Firstly, it explains why Ra, the sun god, does not rule on earth directly, why he stays in the sky and rules from a distance. The reason, basically, is that he's sick of us. We have annoyed him with our rebellion, and he has become sick of heart, unwilling to tolerate us and afraid that he might slaughter us if we do it again. Also, Ra has become worried that another threat may come forth, and while he has destroyed this rebellion, the second one might be more successful. So, the sun god decides to withdraw. He will reign on high and let earth be handled by others. The second key point is that we learn the identity of the sky cow. We might have assumed that it was Hathor, for she is the famous cow deity. But actually, the sky cow is Nut. In order to support her divine father Ra, Nut transforms into a great cow and strides across the horizons, supporting Ra on her back. In that sense, the story maybe has a little bit of a twist to it. You think it is about one goddess, but actually it's about another. Those 2 points, arguably, are the key thrust of the tale. There is one final bit, though. We have wrapped up most of the major storylines, but Ra's enemies still need to be redeemed. The humans on Earth have to make atonement. Quote, "Now humans approached, and they saw Ra upon the back of this sky cow. And the people said to Ra, 'The rebellious ones had risen up against you, but we have come so that we might overthrow your enemies, the ones who plotted against their creators.' Despite this, His Majesty Ra proceeded to his palace on the back of this cow. He did not go with the humans. Thus, the land lay in darkness. Then Ra spoke to Nut, saying, 'I have placed myself upon your back so that I may be uplifted into the sky.' Nut responded, 'That is what this is.' And so she came to be there in the sky as well, during the day and the night. The Majesty of Ra said to Nut, 'Stay far away from the humans. Lift me up. Look at me.' And so Nut became the sky, and the Majesty of Ra, the sun, was visible within her. But Nut said to Ra, 'I wish that you would provide me with a multitude for company.' Ra did so, and thus the Milky Way came into being." End quote. As Ra takes his place in the sky, the tale of the rebellion ends. The slaughter is over, humanity is cowed and subjugated, and Sekhmet has returned to the divine court. But the rebellion has taken its toll. The sun god, aging and weakened, has grown frustrated and does not wish to dwell among us. And when the people come to him, apologizing for those who had rebelled, Ra is unswayed by their words. He continues to leave, and the land is punished with darkness. At this point, Ra takes up his residence, one that he continues to enjoy today. It seems that the sky itself is still not fully formed, for when Ra withdraws into the heavens, Nut, who comes with him, is slightly lonely in her job. And so, Ra populates the body of Nut with a multitude of stars, creating the Milky Way. Again, we are dealing with etiology, an explanation for why the world is the way that it is. To put it simply, some of it is our fault. The distance of the sun god and the stars in the sky itself are the indirect result of humanity's rebellion and disorder. So in one sense, the etiology is quite simple. The world is the way that it is because humans are a mess. Part 1 of the tale ends here. What follows it is a series of vignettes in which Ra decrees various aspects of the world, organizing its institutions and phenomena. It's somewhat tangential to the main story, so I'm not going to cover it in detail today. We will return to that part of the story in future. For now, let's put a pin in the rebellion of humanity and Ra's withdrawal into the sky. Let's take a look at the background, the scholarship around this story, why it shows up around 1300 BCE, and what it can tell us about ancient Egyptian religion. That is after the break. See you in a moment. Around 1300 BCE, the Book of the Sky Cow tells us of rebellion committed by humanity against the power of Ra. And this story gives an explanation for the sun god's absence on Earth, why, with all his power, Ra does not come and rule us directly, why he remains in the sky, and why we fend for ourselves. The origins of the story are a little bit unclear, and different scholars interpret them differently. The language of the text itself can be dated to the period called the 18th dynasty, between 1500 and 1300 BCE. That date is based on the grammar, how the authors construct their sentences, how they describe certain actions, and so forth. Although hieroglyphs all look the same to a casual glance, scholars can identify trends within the use of that language. Just like modern writing and speaking, the ancient Egyptian language evolved over time. And after 200 years of decipherment and analysis, language historians are getting pretty skilled at identifying even tiny markers of date, location, and authorship. I won't bore you with the nitty-gritty. It's a lot of adjectives, adverbs, and paleography. But if you are interested in that, there is a study by the Egyptologist Anthony Spallinger, published in 2000, that goes deeper on those details. I'll put a reference in the episode description. Beyond the language, though, we do have a pretty good idea of when the story was written, based on its first occurrence. The very first appearance of this tale is in the tomb of King Tutankhamun. Discovered intact in 1922, Tutankhamun's burial included a wealth of treasures. Among those furnishings, the body of Tutankhamun was protected by a set of shrines. 4 canopies made of wood and covered with gold were constructed around the king's coffins and sarcophagus. The largest of these shrines, usually called the first shrine, is decorated with various images and texts. And if you look at the interior, on the very back, you will find an image of the sky cow, just like the one I described at the start. The image is carved into gold on the wall of the shrine, and it has the same imagery and texts that describe the ancient tale. Today, the shrines are in Cairo, in the Grand Egyptian Museum. So if you would like to see the earliest example of the Book of the Sky Cow, you can find it there, on the largest of Tutankhamun's shrines, on the inside at the rear wall. The next version appears in the tomb of Seti I, just off the burial chamber. It is easy to find. When you first enter the room, look for a tiny door on your right. Looking through that door, you will see a cow dominating one wall. That is the second surviving version of the text, and it's actually more complete compared to that of Tutankhamun. The shrine of Tutankhamun has part of the Sky Cow story, but not the whole thing. Maybe they didn't have the space, or maybe they just wanted to reference it without including the full tale. In the tomb of Seti I, we get the complete story for the very first time. Based on that, we can say with some confidence that the text comes from the 18th dynasty, sometime before 1300 BCE. The story itself might be quite old, or even be a compilation of earlier texts put together by an author. One thing we can say is that the idea of the Sky Cow itself is much older than the surviving story. References to this Sky Cow goddess, a form of newt, show up as early as the pyramid texts in the Old Kingdom, around 2350 BCE. And across the centuries, funerary texts do mention this deity and her support of Ra. But the story of the rebellion, of Hathor going nuts with slaughter, that first appears, as far as we know, in the tomb of Tutankhamun. As you can imagine, the date of its appearance has raised certain questions. The fact that it first shows up with Tutankhamun of all people has made some scholars ask, could the idea of a revolt or abandonment of Ra somehow relate to the Amarna period? Could the rebellious humans be a metaphor for Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their followers? That has been argued by scholars like David Lawton, but it hasn't gained much ground for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the grammar of the text, which I mentioned earlier, that seems more suited to the early 18th dynasty, not the later half when Akhenaten was doing his thing. Secondly, the story itself doesn't really line up with the events of the Amarna period. Most notably, Akhenaten was not rebellious against Ra. He loved Ra. The heretic pharaoh was all about the sun god, and his theology explicitly treated Ra, in his form of Aten, the sun disk, as a kind of king on earth. So unless it's one of those, based on a true story, but all of the names have been changed, it's hard to imagine that Akhenaten's religious policy could have inspired this particular tale. You could perhaps argue that the story actually comes from Akhenaten's world, that its discussion of rebellion against Ra reflects Akhenaten's own belief that humanity had somehow neglected or turned away from the true supreme deity. That is certainly possible, and, at least in my mind, it would make more sense for Akhenaten to condemn a rebellion against Ra rather than participate in one. Unfortunately, we simply can't say for sure. We do know that the story first appears around 1300 BCE in the tombs of Tutankhamun and Seti I. But, as I mentioned, there are references to the Sky Cow concept far earlier in Egyptian history. It's entirely possible that the idea of the rebellion is also much older. We simply don't have the surviving texts. For now, the best we can say is that the story might have become popular in the Amarna period, reflecting the heretic pharaoh's own extreme views of Ra and his kingship. But whether it originated there, that is entirely speculative. Speaking of Ra generally, the Book of the Sky Cow is certainly part of a solar theology, the praise and honoring of the sun god. For one thing, the tale focuses almost entirely on Ra as the creator and ruler of the world. That makes sense. even in the wake of the Amarna revolution, the Egyptian pharaohs were always favorable to solar theology. The sun god Ra appears throughout tombs and temples as the supreme creator being. He can take on different forms and names like Amun-Ra, Ra the hidden one, Atum-Ra, Ra the one who is complete or total, and Ra-Horakti, Ra the Horus or ruler of the two horizons. All of these are powerful deities in their own right, worthy of respect and worship. But the common denominator there is Ra, the sun god, as the supreme ruling being. That is a simplification. We could spend hours discussing the syncretisms and interpretations. But you get the point. The Book of the Sky Cow focuses on Ra as the creator. That seems to reflect political and religious trends that were popular around 1300 BCE. Beyond the solar theology, or the possible influences of the Amarna period, there is another big and obvious question about this tale. The Book of the Sky Cow deals with a rebellion against the ruling authority of Egypt. It also includes a group of people who wander off into the desert, and it includes great suffering in the Nile Valley, brought on by the destructive powers of Sekhmet, which, for the ancient audience, would implicitly include plague, pestilence, and death. Finally, it concludes with a time of darkness as the sun god withdraws into the sky. For fans of biblical storytelling, this may sound somewhat familiar. The tale of the Sky Cow has at least a couple of parallels with the biblical Exodus of Moses. In that story, the divine power of Yahweh, the God of Abraham, supposedly brings plague and pestilence to the Nile Valley, an eclipse of the sun casting the land in darkness. And the action of that tale culminates with the Hebrews fleeing into the desert, abandoning the legitimate authority of Egypt, which is the pharaoh, in favor of their own. The meaning of these parallels will depend on your personal religious beliefs or your interest in religious storytelling. Certainly, we seem to have some common threads running through the thought and theologies of two distinct cultures, both of which have important stories that appear, or at least deal with, the early 19th dynasty around 1300 BCE. Obviously, at some point I am going to do an episode about the Exodus, what the biblical tale involves, and how that stacks up with Egyptian archaeology and the known history of these cultures in contact. But here, in a more mythological setting, quote-unquote, we do seem to have interesting parallels in events and themes concerning the legitimate authorities of the gods and the rulers. There may be some common inspirations. Finally, there is at least one more parallel. When Sekhmet goes crazy on Earth and has to be restrained, the manner in which the gods do so does have a superficial resemblance to other stories from other religious traditions. When Ra and his cronies spill fake blood, beer, across the Nile Valley and its fields, they temporarily flood Egypt. In that sense, the story does bear a passing resemblance to the tale of Noah from the Hebrew Bible, or the tales of the deluge from Mesopotamian cultures and others around the world. Here, though, there is a crucial difference. In those tales, the flood is a destructive event, one that comes upon humanity in punishment for their sins or their failings. In the Book of the Sky Cow, the flood is actually a positive. It is something that the gods are doing in order to save humans from a destructive, terrible vengeance. We can draw an obvious parallel in the appearance of this flood, the blood-tinged waters, that again seem to echo aspects of the Exodus story. But at least in terms of flood myths, we do have one here, but the function of the flood and the purpose for which it is created, that is quite different from the other traditions. The Book of the Sky Cow is a tale of many aspects. On the one hand, it is a tale of human failure, our rebellion against the legitimate authority of Ra, that ultimately caused the sun god to withdraw into the sky, removing his presence from the earth itself. On the other, it also gives us explanations for why certain aspects of the natural world and human institutions, like festivals, why they happen the way that they happen. The story itself is longer than the version I have presented here. There is that second half in which the god Ra organizes aspects of the cosmos. We will come back to that in the future when we consider tales of the creation and how the universe was organized by the supreme deities. For now, I hope this introduction has given you some interesting perspectives on the ancient Egyptian worldview, why Earth is the way that it is, and how it's partly our fault. From a social and historical perspective, the tale has a fascinating context. There are references to the divine cow much earlier in Egyptian history, but the tale of the rebellion and the sun god's response to it, that specifically shows up at the end of the 18th dynasty, first in the tomb of King Tutankhamun, and then in a more complete and expanded version in the tomb of Seti I. Clearly, something interesting is happening within Egyptian theology at this time. The stories they are sharing and recording have interesting perspectives on the power of the gods, their place in the cosmos, and how they relate to or interact with humanity. There may be some influence from the Amarna period, either a backlash to or a lingering evocation of Akhenaten's perspectives and philosophies. Simultaneously, we do get tantalizing hints of a storytelling tradition that would later be picked up by a famous biblical narrative. The Book of the Sky Cow has a lot more going on than I'm able to cover in this simple podcast. If you would like to read the tale in its full version, including the second half in which Ra organizes the cosmos, I have put some references in the episode description to sources that are available online and include the full translation. I will come back to this tale in the future, both to cover the second half and to consider it with other texts that explain the creation and the role of the gods. For now, it is time to bring this chapter to an end. The History of Egypt podcast is supported by you, the listeners. Thank you for joining me for this tale of ancient mythology and the bloodthirsty destruction by Hathor and Sekhmet, for helping to quell the goddess, and for supporting the show at the highest possible tier. I would like to thank my priest-level supporters from patreon.com. These fine folks prepare the jugs of blood-tinged beer in order to bring Sekhmet down and to celebrate the festivals of Hathor. Special thanks must go to Linda, Ashley, Eric, Veronica, Terry, James, TJ, Arthur, Yola, Karen, Mycost, Jeffrey, Andy and Chelsea, Jean, Kyla, Nidin, and Dan. And I would like to welcome Si Yin to the ranks of the priesthood, who joined for an entire year. Si Yin, you are generous beyond words. Your offerings fill the tables and the temples. I am forever in your debt. To everyone listening, thank you for joining me. May the forces of evil become drunk and confused before ever they find you. May any gods who might wish you harm be withdrawn into the sky and instead sparkle on the body of Nut, populating the Milky Way. Thank you for listening. I will see you soon.